I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, and knew I had to get this off my chest. It happened when I was about 16, living with my dad and brothers in a dilapidated house that seemed to be miles from anywhere. We rented it privately. My brother did odd jobs for the landlord in exchange for rent. The landlord wasn't someone I'd call creepy, at least not when I saw him talking to my dad. But I seldom went outside when he visited. One day, my dad and brothers went out, leaving me alone with my dog in the fenced yard. I was upstairs in my room, absorbed in playing The Sims 2, when I noticed a car pulling up the long driveway. It wasn't my dad's, and a wave of unease crashed over me. Panic set in as I dashed to close all the blinds, turn off the lights, and check the locks on every door. It was the landlord. He lived about 2 miles away, which was the closest house to ours. This wasn't the first time he'd shown up unannounced. On 2 previous occasions, I'd been home alone, and each time he stayed only for 10 minutes, walking around the house before leaving. But today felt different. I grabbed a large kitchen knife and crouched under the kitchen table. I heard him pull up outside and open our front gate. My dog went berserk, barking wildly. I heard him shout, "Shut up, mutt!" The sound of his footsteps came closer as he approached the front door. My heart pounded as I sent a text to my dad, knowing he wouldn't be back for at least an hour. The landlord moved around the house, trying each window. He attempted to open all 3 doors. My fear grew when he started calling out my name. He knew I was alone. I couldn't hear his exact words through the thick walls, but I followed the sound of his voice, creeping from room to room. Then, through the quiet of the house, I heard a chilling declaration. "I'm going to burn the house down, but I'll let you out first." The threat was more terrifying because I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. It was clear he wanted me to come out, to believe him. That realization made my blood run cold. I could only imagine what might have happened if I had gone outside. He was persistent, staying for what felt like forever, at least 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Just as he left, my dad pulled into the driveway. I recounted everything that had happened, and we moved out soon after. To this day, I don't know how the landlord knew I was alone. My dad hadn't seen him on his way out. He must have known my dad was gone because of the empty driveway. But how did he know I wasn't with him? When I was around 24, I found myself struggling to make ends meet in a bustling city. Rent prices were sky high, so when I stumbled across a listing for an entire top floor of a duplex at just $775 a month, I jumped on it. 6 rooms for that price. It seemed like a miracle. The real estate agent mentioned that the landlords were deeply religious. I didn't give it much thought at the time, thinking it wouldn't affect me. I was just thrilled to find an affordable place. The landlords were an elderly couple who lived downstairs. At first they seemed pleasant enough. Every time I passed them outside, they would give me a polite smile, nothing more. I kept the house tidy and stayed out of their way, but things shifted when they realized I had a boyfriend visiting regularly. It began subtly. One afternoon I was writing in my little office when I heard a knock on the door. Expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor, I opened it. There stood the old woman from downstairs. Her face was blank, but there was something unsettling in her eyes. She didn't say hello or offer any pleasantries. Instead, she asked, "Have you ever done something you regret?" I froze, unsure what she was getting at, but before I could even respond, she walked away, leaving me standing there, confused. After that, I started feeling like I was being watched. The layout of the duplex was strange. There was a door at the base of a staircase that I assumed led to a laundry room. One day, out of curiosity, I opened it. To my shock, it opened directly into the landlord's living room. It felt invasive. From that moment on, I made a mental note to stay far away from that door. Then one evening while I was cooking dinner, I heard a soft click. It was faint, but loud enough to get my attention. I turned off the stove and listened. I was alone. My boyfriend was working late that night, so I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up on me. I wandered through the apartment, checking the rooms. Nothing. Finally, I approached the staircase that led to the landlord's part of the house. That's when I saw her. The old woman was standing there, just a few steps down, staring at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. For a moment, we locked eyes, neither of us moving. I screamed. She jerked backward and slammed the door to her apartment shut. I didn't feel safe anymore. After that encounter, I started noticing little things around the apartment. I'd leave for work and return to find a window closed when I was sure I had left it open. My towels hung up to dry would sometimes be damp as if someone had used them. The shower head dripped even though I hadn't used it. There was no way to lock the door that led into their part of the house. They were the only ones with a key. The knocking at my door became relentless, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. It got to the point where my boyfriend and I propped an old mattress against the wall just to muffle the sound. The breaking point came one morning when I opened the door to leave for work, only to find that the stairs leading down were gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where the steps used to be. In their place, on the porch below, were the dismantled stairs, piled up like discarded furniture. I tried calling the landlords, but they didn't answer. I was stuck. After an hour of waiting, their son finally emerged. Without so much as an apology, he explained that they were remodeling the porch and told me I would have to cut through their apartment downstairs. Reluctantly, I made my way down. The moment I opened the door, the smell hit me. Stale, like old food left out too long. The couple was sitting at their kitchen table, motionless, staring straight ahead. Their faces were blank and they didn't say a word. The phone sat on the table, clearly in working order, so I knew they had heard my calls earlier. I didn't linger. I crossed the room as quickly as possible and let myself out through their back door. A few days later, I came home to find water pooling on the bathroom floor. It wasn't just a leak. It looked like someone had left the faucet running for hours. As I tried to clean up the mess, the old woman came upstairs screaming that I had caused the flood and that her son would need to come fix it. I was so exhausted by then, I didn't argue. I just nodded and waited for her son to arrive. When he finally came, it was obvious he'd been drinking. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. I told him I needed a moment before he started working, but before I could finish my sentence, he picked up a heavy wrench from his toolbox and swung it at me. I barely dodged it, the wrench missing my head by inches. He lost his balance and stumbled, giving me just enough time to bolt down the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside, dialing 911. The police came, took my statement, but in the end, told me there wasn't much they could do since no physical harm had been done. It didn't take long to learn why. The old couple's daughter was an officer herself. I felt trapped. That night, we packed up everything we could into my boyfriend's van. We didn't even wait until morning. With the help of a few friends, we loaded up what little we owned and drove off. For the next month, we lived out of hotels in the van until we finally found a new place. I never went back to that duplex, and the landlords never contacted me. I had been searching for an apartment for weeks, and the options were either too expensive or in areas I didn't feel comfortable living in. Time was running out, and I needed to move fast. So when I found a decent place with 3 rooms in a quiet neighborhood, I jumped on it. It wasn't perfect, but it was newly renovated and the landlord had promised new appliances, which was good enough for the time being. A month after I moved in, there was a knock on my door. I peeked through the peephole and saw 2 men standing outside. One held a piece of paper and simply said, "Fridge." I opened the door, assuming they were here to deliver the fridge that was supposed to arrive 2 weeks earlier. One man, the delivery guy, rolled the fridge inside, while the other, who looked unkempt and dirty, stood behind him, watching. I thought maybe he was a helper. As the delivery guy finished up, the scruffy man smiled at me and introduced himself as the new landlord. I didn't question it much. Landlords change all the time, and I didn't really care as long as everything worked out with the apartment. The delivery man left, but the new landlord lingered. He started asking me strange questions. Why I was living alone in such a big apartment where my family was. He seemed overly interested in my personal life. I brushed it off as awkward conversation, but something about his demeanor made me uncomfortable. He stood in the kitchen, opening and closing the fridge door, not saying much, but just staring. I waited for him to leave, trying not to show how uneasy I was becoming. He eventually left, telling me that he lived on the first floor if I ever needed anything. I locked the door the moment he stepped out. A few days later, I was getting ready to start my new job at a nearby electronics store. I was excited, but as I walked out of the apartment building, I heard a voice behind me. It was him again, the landlord, asking where I was going. I mumbled something about work and kept walking, hoping he'd take the hint. I hadn't gone far when a car slowed down beside me. The passenger window rolled down, and there he was again, offering me a ride. I declined, but he insisted, saying he was heading in the same direction and that it would save me time. Against my better judgment, I got in the car. The drive was short, but the conversation was unsettling. He asked for my phone number, and I lied, saying my phone was broken. He gave me his number instead and kept pressing me to call him, even asking when I'd be done with work so he could pick me up. I got out of the car as quickly as I could and threw the paper with his number away the moment he left. Over the next few days, I started avoiding the elevator, taking the stairs instead to avoid running into him. It worked for a while. I didn't see him again until one night when there was a knock at my door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there. He knocked again, asking why he hadn't seen me leaving for work, and why I never called him like I said I would. I hadn't said I would call him, but he seemed genuinely upset about it. I stayed calm, explaining that my work schedule was strange and I didn't have time to call anyone. He seemed irritated, but after a long pause, he left. The next morning, I took the elevator again, thinking maybe he'd forgotten about me by now. But when the doors opened, there he was, standing in the lobby. He offered me a ride to work again. I declined and quickly walked out, but it was starting to feel like he was watching me constantly. For the next few months, he followed me whenever he saw me leaving the building. He'd ask me to hang out, offer me rides, and even knocked on my door late at night, making excuses to talk to me. Once, I saw him in the middle of a conversation with another tenant, but as soon as he saw me, he abandoned the conversation and followed me outside, asking again if I needed a ride. At work, things got worse. My coworkers and manager knew about him by this point, and they told me to hide in the back anytime he showed up at the store. He'd come in, walk around, and leave when he didn't see me. One time I watched him scan the store from behind a display, his eyes searching every aisle. He even told me once that he sometimes thought about kidnapping me, about just taking me away to keep me for himself. I didn't know what to say. He smiled when he said it like it was some kind of joke. But there was a seriousness in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I knew I should have called the police, but I didn't have any real proof. He hadn't hurt me physically, and I wasn't sure they would take me seriously. Besides, he knew where I lived, and I didn't want to make things worse, so I just tried to avoid him as much as I could. One night, I woke up to the sound of the fire alarm. I remembered there was supposed to be a fire drill that day, and I rushed to get ready before they came to check the alarms in the apartment. Just as I was about to leave, there was a knock at the door. It was the maintenance guy checking the alarm, and the landlord, of course. They did the check and left, but almost immediately the landlord knocked again, saying he needed to talk to me. I stayed quiet, hoping he'd go away. After a few minutes of knocking and calling out, he finally stopped. I had plans to visit a friend that night, so I finished getting ready and left the apartment around 11 p.m. I took the elevator down, and when the doors opened, I saw him standing by his door. He hadn't seen me yet, so I quickly darted for the front entrance, but just as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. He was following me. I ran outside and around the building, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but when I looked back, he was still there, chasing me. We ran for what felt like hours, both of us stopping occasionally to catch our breath. Every time I thought I had lost him, he was right behind me again. Finally, I couldn't run anymore. My lungs burned and I had no energy left. I turned to face him, ready to fight if I had to. He slowed down, breathing heavily, and looked at me with a strange mix of desperation and anger. He mumbled something about not wanting me to leave, about how lonely he was, but I didn't care. I was done running. I turned and walked away, expecting him to follow, but he didn't. He just stood there watching me disappear into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him. I moved out of my apartment recently, and honestly, I had no choice. I couldn't stay there anymore. The place was great, but the landlords made me feel so unsafe that I had to leave. It was this nice, expensive apartment in Dumbo, Brooklyn. I shared it with a roommate who covered most of the rent since her parents were loaded. The landlords were this seemingly sweet couple who lived a few floors above us with their kids. At first, things were normal. The only weird thing was their kids. Every time I saw them in the elevator, they'd scream at me just before getting off and then run away laughing. It was odd but kind of funny at first, just kids being kids. Then one day I ran into their eldest son in the elevator. He was my age but did the same thing, screaming and running off. I didn't give it too much thought. Maybe he was just messing around with his younger siblings. But things started getting weird after I bumped into the whole family together. We were having a casual chat, and out of nowhere the dad apologized, saying something about his son acting strangely because of a condition he had. The way he said it was unsettling, but I shrugged it off and ended the conversation as quickly as I could. A few days later, I was in the elevator again and I ran into the dad. This time he started talking about how lucky I was to have the apartment and how generous he was for giving us such a good deal on rent. Then he asked if I could babysit his kids that night since he, his wife, and his eldest son were going to dinner. At first I said no, but he offered to pay me $150 an hour. That kind of money was hard to turn down, so I reluctantly agreed. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was a huge mistake. When I got to their apartment, I was blown away. It took up the entire floor, easily the nicest place I'd ever been in. I settled in, playing video games with the kids. Everything seemed fine for about an hour until I heard the front door slam. I told the kids to stay put and went to see what was going on. I found the dad stumbling through the hallway, clearly drunk. He made his way over to the couch and collapsed face first onto it. I had to hold back my laughter, but I walked over to check on him. When I got closer, he turned his head toward me and muttered something strange about his wife. Before I could figure out what he was talking about, his wife appeared. She thanked me, paid me for the night, and told me I could leave. I was confused, but I didn't ask questions. I just left. I got back to my apartment and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I told my roommate about it, and she said she'd had a weird encounter with the dad too. He had randomly told her, "My wife is cool, just so you know," before walking away. We both felt uneasy, and from that point on, we knew we wouldn't be renewing our lease. Things got even more uncomfortable after that. We didn't see the landlords for a while, but when we did, it was always awkward. One time I was with my boyfriend in the elevator when the landlords got in. They didn't say a word, just kept smiling and nodding at us. When we got off, the dad called out to us and winked at me just as the doors closed. After that, I asked my boyfriend to stay with us until the lease was up. I didn't want to be there alone anymore. The final encounter was the worst. It was a few days before we were supposed to move out. My roommate stepped out of the apartment and found the landlords sitting by the elevators waiting for us. When they saw her, they started crying, begging us to stay. They apologized for making us uncomfortable, saying they thought we were the young girls they had been waiting for. My roommate didn't say a word, just got into the elevator and called me to warn me they were outside. A few minutes later, they knocked on our door. My boyfriend answered, and when the dad saw him, he asked if I was home. My boyfriend lied and said I wasn't, but they still tried to push their way inside. That's when I came out of my room and told them I'd call the police if they didn't leave. They panicked, apologized, and ran off. A few days after that, we got a text from a random number. It was an offer. 6 months rent-free if we just gave them a few nights. I blocked the number immediately. Looking back, it was such a disturbing experience, especially knowing that they had keys to our apartment the entire time. I'm just glad we got out of there when we did. I had just moved into a new house last weekend. It was an old place from the 1940s with a strange layout and an unfinished attic. It wasn't in the best shape, but it was all I could find on short notice. I spotted the house on an online rental site and called the number listed. The landlord was quick to respond, but he had a nagging, unsettling demeanor. He was very insistent that I confirm my interest repeatedly, making me uneasy. Despite that, I scheduled a viewing for Saturday. The house was intended for me and my elderly mother, who uses a wheelchair. When I arrived with her, the landlord greeted us with an overly enthusiastic smile. The moment he saw my mother, his expression soured. He seemed visibly displeased that she was with me. I awkwardly tried to explain that I hadn't mentioned her because he hadn't asked. The house itself was adequate, so we decided to take it. We paid the deposit and settled in over the weekend. On the 6th, I paid the first month's rent. The landlord informed me that he would need access to the house for some plumbing work. I said it was fine, but that I'd be at work and would leave the key under the mat. I told him I'd be home after 1 p.m. He sent multiple texts asking me to confirm that I wouldn't be there before 1 p.m. because of a supposed safety hazard. I reassured him I would be out until after 1 p.m. That day, I finished work early and decided to stop by the house to let him know I was back, but would stay outside. The house's layout was unusual. The front door opened directly into the living room, which then led to a hallway and several rooms. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As I did, I saw the landlord rushing out of my bedroom, making a hasty exit through the living room and out the back door. His car sped off from the driveway. Feeling a surge of anxiety, I went straight to my bedroom. I was horrified to find my personal items scattered. My drawers were open and things were thrown around. The unsettling realization hit me hard. My privacy had been invaded, and I felt a deep sense of violation. Determined to protect myself and my belongings, I decided to take action. I bought a motion-sensing camera and set it up to monitor the house. A few days later, I reviewed the footage and was stunned by what I saw. The camera recorded the landlord arriving at the house in the dead of night. He spent time trying to peer into the windows while we were not there. The footage was clear and disturbing. I felt a cold shiver as I watched the video. The house was supposed to be a refuge, but now it felt like a trap. Each night I found myself on edge, wondering if he would come back or if something even worse was lurking. The uncertainty and fear were overwhelming, and I had to keep living with the constant dread of what might come next. The situation felt far from over, and I remained alert, unsure of what the landlord's next move might be. The house, once a new beginning, had turned into a source of relentless anxiety.